being here this evening. How do you introduce somebody that everybody knows? It really is always a great honor and a great pleasure to have Father David Neuhaus here speaking, because I think, speaking on behalf of everybody, we always learn something, or we hear something at a much different level that really stirs us. So this evening, Father David is presenting Nostra Aetate. And so without further ado, David, thank you.
So, good evening again. What Father John Paul did not say is that you'll inevitably hear something that will irritate you profoundly, or provoke you, or make you want to throw tomatoes at me. So I'm hoping there'll be an interesting time of exchange afterwards. But as you can see, I'm not really going to be discussing Nostra Aetate, but I'm going to be commemorating Nostra Aetate by looking back at what made the document and then trying to look forward. And why are we doing that? Because in October we will be celebrating 60 years since the end of the Council, and on the 28th of October, 60 years since the publication of Nostra Aetate. Now, of course, we're assuming that everybody knows what Nostra Aetate is, but you can see from the picture, for those who don't, that it was a major event in St. Peter's. Okay? Before we actually get into the subject, I want to start immediately with something that has been on my mind, and that is that I think we're all aware, unless we just came down from Mars, that we're in a time of crisis. And we're in a time of crisis at every level, but also in the types of relationships that Nostra Aetate envisioned, interreligious dialogue. You can see there that I put a picture of the Pope. And in my opinion, and I'll be perfectly honest right from the beginning, he has been one of the voices of great clarity. I say that not because I'm a Catholic, not because I'm a Jesuit, but because I really think that the way that he has been trying to address reality has been a wake-up call. And so I start with this picture really focusing on the crisis, and what I wrote under it is inspired by a book that I just finished reading 2 days ago. I started reading it 3 days ago, so it really gripped me. And it's a book by an American journalist, a professor of journalism by the name of Peter Beinart. His name might be well known already. And his most recent book, just come out in January 2025, you can see it here, is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, a Reckoning. So I thought I'd like to insert this also as an alternative title tonight, Being a Person of Dialogue After the Destruction of Gaza. Again, I promise there'll be time at the end to shout at me, respond, agree with me, perhaps one or two. This is what I wrote as the introduction to tonight's lecture. This talk marks the 60th anniversary since the publication of Nostra Aetate, the declaration of the Church, again that's very supremacist, I should say the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, not just the Roman Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church, on non-Christian religions. Looking back at the Second Vatican Council, this lecture will examine the processes that led to this astounding development in the Church's teaching in order to recapture a dynamic that can lead us forward now in this time of crisis in seeking understanding, dialogue, and collaboration with our neighbors who belong to different religious traditions, especially Jews and Muslims. Now, in order to try and get our mind around all of that, I'd like to start with a musical prelude that comes from the Holy Father, Pope Francis's visit to Morocco. And we can watch these few minutes of what I think is beauty and harmony, and then we can dive into the lecture.
Et c'est maintenant l'Orchestre Philharmonique du Maroc qui, comme je vous le disais tout à l'heure, propose un temps spirituel.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله شهد خير غنيمة أدوني خات
So, an audiovisual icon of Nostra Aetate, a harmonious reality that we might have lost sight of because of what is going on around us. I do want to underline in the first part of this lecture how revolutionary Nostra Aetate was. And let's just remember very briefly some of the headlines that made Nostra Aetate an enormous change, a 180-degree turnaround from what Christians had heard and been taught through the centuries. So, just again, headlines: no salvation outside the church. We had all the truth, and everyone around us was plunged in darkness. Non-Christian religions, if we thought about them, were basically an expression of ignorance at best. We had constructed empires based upon our religion. We had sent out missionaries who, yes, preached Jesus Christ, but also preached European civilization and imposed it wherever they went. And much of this came crashing down during the Second World War. And in the aftermath of the war, we woke up, particularly if we were white Europeans, to the horror of the Shoah. That 6 million Jews had been genocided together with tens of millions of other people who died during those terrible years. Nostra Aetate begins to take form in a time where reason is already, for some centuries, a criterion for how people behave. Secularism is widespread, and modernity is posing a challenge to tradition. Already, we're now in the early 60s, decolonization is in progress. Europe is receding, withdrawing. We are more and more aware of the problems of racism, and anti-racism is becoming a powerful expression as people take to the streets. The church, finally, is undergoing also a process of indigenization. We recognize that other people, non-European people, can be leaders in the church. They can serve as clergy for their own people, and then bishops, and who knows, perhaps a pope. The questions of peace, justice, and ecology become predominant preoccupations. And it is within this context that we have the convening of the council. You see here again the gathering of thousands of bishops from all over the world, and important to underline, not only bishops, but observers from other churches, and on occasion, people belonging to other religious communities. And let's underline also people who have no faith at all, coming together to discuss where are we going. And you see there the two popes that led us through the council. Pope John the 23rd, Saint John the 23rd, became Pope in 1958. It was Pope John who very much was at the center of bringing the council to fruition, making it happen. Together with a team, we'll see a little of that team in a moment. Pope John died in 1963 while the council was in process, and he would be succeeded by Pope Paul VI, who led the council through to its finishing stages. These two men represent something very important in the history of the Church. John the 23rd, a beautiful modern icon by John Lenz, if I'm not mistaken. The icon, John has a scroll. We are not on earth to guard a museum, but to cultivate a flourishing garden of life. If I was to choose for myself one word that represents Pope John, it would be that wonderful Italian expression, aggiornamento. Sayidna, is that a word that exists in Italian, or did he make it up?
Yes.
Okay. So, but a beautiful word to say, let's get up to date. Okay? Or, it's very stuffy in here. Can someone please open the windows? By the way, I said that the other day in a lecture about Nostra Aetate to Salesian students. What can you expect, Salesian students? Somebody went to open the window. I said, no, you didn't get the point. Aggiornamento. John the 23rd witnessed up close the horrors of the Second World War. He was, of course, already a bishop, a nuncio, and he spent at least a part of that war, the years leading up to the war and then the war years, in countries like Bulgaria, separated brethren, Greece, and then Turkey, coming into contact, of course, with a land of Islam. Also important to perhaps point out is that when he was nuncio in Turkey, he turned the nunciatura into a printing press. What was he printing? False documents to get Jews out of Europe. And John the 23rd is very, very much beloved by the Jewish people. When he started thinking about the council, he invited to come and see him a very well-known French Jewish historian by the name of Jules Isaac. Jules Isaac, who had gone through the concentration camps and the death camps, lost his wife and children in the concentration camp and death camps, was a historian who devoted studies to the history of the Church's attitude to the Jewish people. And it is he who summed it up saying, there is an enseignement du mépris, a teaching of contempt. By the way, I do want to say that he had already met with Pius XII after the Seligsburg Conference in 1946, and now he came to see Pope John in 1960, insisting that the Church must change the enseignement du mépris, the teaching of contempt, and make it a teaching of respect. But overwhelmingly, Pope John wanted a better world. He wanted a world in which there would be no more war. He wanted a world in which human beings would recognize the humanity of the other, even enemies. And I put there an encyclical that some of us might remember, Pacem in terris, peace on earth. Pope John, Man of the Year for Time magazine. I want to throw open the windows of the church so that we can see out and the people can see in. That meeting place after so many decades of a church that had closed itself off from the world, a church that was full of suspicion about the rest of humanity. As I mentioned, Pope John died in 1963, and he was succeeded by Pope Paul VI. And again, if I would choose one word that sums up Pope Paul VI's contribution to the processing at Vatican II, it would be the word dialogue. Pope Paul VI was a man of dialogue. Dialogue with everyone, but particularly with intellectuals, him being a great intellectual. His trips the first trip he made would be the first trip of a pope outside of Italy in centuries, and he came right here in 1964. A trip to the sources of the Christian faith, and he came also with the intention, and he carried it out, to meet his brother in faith, Athenagoras, the Patriarch of Constantinople. And here there would be an incredible moment of encounter after centuries of anathema, and those anathemas would be cancelled. But the Pope also went to India, and notice he stopped for 59 minutes in Beirut. Again, take into account he's going into lands where he's meeting not only Christians, but in a spirit of dialogue, that very important word for Pope Paul VI, a spirit of dialogue, meeting with Muslims, very brief encounters in Israel with Jews, then to India with Hindus. Again, I mentioned he stopped for 59 minutes in Beirut. He would continue, and Paul VI had a great interest in the encounter with Islam. He would go to Turkey in 1967, to Uganda in 1969, to Iran, Pakistan, and Indonesia in 1970. Incredible visits outside of the Catholic world. Of course, he traveled a lot. What I chose were the visits that took him outside of the usual orbit of Christians, and here is a pope going around and encouraging dialogue. One of the great intellectuals who was a close friend was Jacques Maritain. And Jacques Maritain, many of us will remember, had very important writings about the Jewish people. Starting from the 1930s, he himself was married to a Jewish convert, herself a great thinker, Raïssa Maritain, and he produced a series of essays called Le Mystère d'Israël, the mystery of Israel. And he was a close friend of Pope Paul VI, who at one point wanted to make him a cardinal. But also, Paul VI was deeply involved with those that were interested in Islam. Louis Massignon, Joachim Mubarak, the movement that they began, Al-Badaliyye, and it seems that he frequented meetings of Al-Badaliyye in Italy, Al-Badaliyye being what today would be regarded as rather a problematic movement, but certainly a very intimate engagement with Islam. And for those that would like to know more, Stephanie, who's sitting here, knows a lot about it, but we can also look up on the internet, Al-Badaliyye. Paul VI and dialogue. His first encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam of 1964. I read there from the photograph, it would indeed be a disgrace if our dialogue were marked by arrogance, the use of bad words or offensive bitterness, setting in place a dynamic of dialogue. The aim of the encyclical was to show, and I quote, how vital it is for the world and how greatly desired by the Catholic Church that the two should meet together and get to know and love one another. This is a revolution. For decades, the Church taught that the world was a place to be suspicious of. The world was a place in which the devil reigns supreme. And now we were looking again. And I will hasten to add and say, this is a church that is discovering that sometimes the devil that we see so clearly in the world is very much at home among Christians. Again, remember, decolonizing, discovering the horrors of the Shoah, facing the threat of wars without end. The church was called to an ever deeper self-knowledge that would stimulate renewal and lead to dialogue with the world. The church must enter into dialogue with the world in which it lives. These are the intuitions and perspectives that give birth to the document that is Nostra Aetate. Now, for the one or two people that might not know well Nostra Aetate, very briefly the structure of the document. Paragraph 1, an introduction. Paragraph 2, a very brief document dealing with traditional religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. Then a paragraph, and we'll talk about it more in depth, about Muslims. And then what I will insist is the core of the document, the heart of this document, for the good and the bad, is the longest part of the document, paragraph 4, on the Jews, the relationship with the Jewish people, and then a conclusion. Tonight we will not be looking much at paragraph 2. We will briefly make reference to the introduction and the conclusion. We will spend a little bit more time talking about paragraph 4 first, for reasons which I'll explain in a moment, and then paragraph 3, which is extremely important for our lives here in the Middle East as well. So, why first? Why are we looking at Nostra Aetate, paragraph number 4 first? And I think it's not any secret to say that for Pope John the 23rd, the idea was first, this was his primary intuition, we need something about the Jewish people in the Vatican Council. We need some kind of brief tractate about the Jews. Very much aware, as I already pointed out, talking with Jules Isaac and many others who came to see Pope John the 23rd from the Jewish community, that the church had to radically change the way that Christians spoke about Jews. What was the common traditional discourse? They killed Jesus. And by the way, I think you probably know he's God. So they killed God. They are a deicide people, stubborn, arrogant. Until now, they refuse to believe in Jesus. A discourse that Jules Isaac called a teaching of contempt. And the challenge, and I believe that John the 23rd was absolutely aware of it, was to start formulating a teaching of respect. Again, focusing on the Jewish people. Now we see here in the photographs, first of all, Cardinal Augustin Beyer, a German. Interesting. We remember what years we're in after the Holocaust. A Jesuit who was head of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. That too is of great importance, the Bible, the heritage that brings us together with the Jews. And Augustin Beyer was the one who was going to work on these questions of dialogue, inter-Christian dialogue, but in a particular way, the question of the Jewish people. How can we formulate a teaching of respect? I think that many of you will recognize that he is sitting in that photograph together with one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, a man who died in 1972, a rabbi, a philosopher, a teacher, who has written incredible books, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel came to the council. Interesting, for Heschel it was not an easy thing to do. He consulted with many of his rabbi friends. One of them told him, please don't go. We don't want to talk to them after what they've done to us. Another one said, we have nothing to say to them anyway. Their religion is based upon the attempt to wipe us out. But Heschel came and met with Beyer, met with Paul VI, and had a lasting impact on the document that Nostra Aetate became. Another man, very active, who was promoting dialogue, was Nahum Goldman, who was the head of the World Jewish Congress, a European Jew who had suffered much during the Holocaust, and he himself a great promoter of the dialogue. We'll look very briefly at this incredible revolution, the first words of paragraph 4. And again, they are not self-evident. As the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, meaning, as we look at ourselves, we as Christians, looking at who we are as Church, the Church remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock. Every word of this paragraph was debated, questioned, weighed, and this is the final formulation. It bears marks of Jacques Maritain, bears marks of Don Dossetti, for those who remember who Don Dossetti is, okay? And again, it takes Catholics into a real meditation on what we have in common with the Jewish people. I would judge, and again, this is open for discussion, that the most important innovation in this paragraph is summed up in these words: God holds the Jews most dear. 180-degree turnaround from God hates the Jews and has rejected them. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes, of the calls he issues. Such is the witness of the apostle. And the apostle here is, of course, St. Paul. The text being referred to is a text that had almost never been quoted in the magisterium of the Church and now became pivotal in the attempt to reformulate relations with the Jewish people. Romans chapter 11, verse 29, repeated over and over again, particularly during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. By the way, the statue that you see is a reformulation of the teaching of contempt. How many people here have been to Notre Dame in Paris, or to the cathedral in Strasbourg, or the cathedral in Trier, or many, many other cathedrals in the Catholic world? At the portals of the cathedral, Notre Dame, Strasbourg, Trier, and others, you had two women who looked like twins, one on each side of the door. But there was a difference between these two women. One of them was standing straight, erect, crowned, with a scepter of authority in her hand, looking straight out into the world. She is a queen, and her name is Ecclesia, Church. The woman who looks like her twin is portrayed very differently. Her head is sunk. Her eyes are blindfolded. The crown that had once been on her head has fallen off, and the scepter of authority she holds in her hand is broken. Her name is Synagoga. Now look at this statue. We can immediately tell which one is Synagoga and which is Ecclesia, but look at the relationship between the two of them as they study in Chevruta. They study together the scriptures that they read differently. Synagoga holds the scroll, and Ecclesia holds the codex. This beautiful statue is on the grounds of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Until there, I've said probably nothing new, but very, very provocative for those of us watching what's happening in Gaza. At the council, there were voices that were dissonant voices. Voices that in some sense were prophetic. Who do we see here in the picture? Well, we see our roly-poly, lovely Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd, deeply marked by the suffering of the Jewish people during the Shoah, But in these two pictures, he is meeting people who are deeply, deeply marked by somebody else's suffering. Not the suffering of the Jewish people, but the suffering of the Palestinian people. And they will bring loud and clear that suffering to the council. First, we have, and I mention him first because here we are Roman Catholics. No, not all of us are, but I am. So it's our patriarch from those years, Alberto Gori, like our present patriarch, an Italian and a Franciscan, but of course the patriarch of a local church that is a suffering church, a Palestinian church predominantly and not only. Alberto Gori will be a voice of dissonance at the council, but much more important than Alberto Gori, because he is one of the central fathers at the council, is the patriarch of the Greek Catholic Church, Maximus IV, Maximus Seir, who will be a clarion voice calling for many, many progressive changes, including, of course, the fact that the Catholic Church is far too Roman. In fact, interesting, a little side, he will refuse to address the council in Latin. He will insist to speak French, to show this is not a Roman council. But he will also stand up very strongly for the rights of the Oriental churches, insisting that patriarchs are preeminent over cardinals. But what interests us tonight, and I've been reading his words, his writings, over the last weeks as I think more and more about Vatican II, and seeing the prophetic voice he raised about how are we going to speak about the Jewish people that will not mean further suffering for the Palestinian people. Very interesting. He is aware of Jewish suffering. He writes about the Holocaust. He disavows very strongly anti-Semitism. And his voice will raise other voices in the Arab world, including a very interesting statement from the Arab League against anti-Semitism. But at the same time, these voices from the Middle East will say, be careful of the political dimension. You are thinking of Jews as a minority, a suffering minority, and they are in Europe, but not in Palestine. In Palestine, they have become a dominant majority. And so, yes, paragraph 4 will include the insistence that this statement is not written from a political point of view, moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love. Eventually, this will placate many of the bishops in the Arab world who at first opposed paragraph 4. Back to the revolutionary nature of this paragraph, paragraph 4. Catholics, in a new teaching of respect, speak about shared roots with the Jewish people, of course, referring to predominantly what Christians call the Old Testament. They will insist now on Jesus being Jewish. We all know, right, that Jesus was not Catholic. His mother was a good Polish Catholic, but Jesus was Jewish. No, Jesus was not Jewish. Jesus is Jewish because he is alive. He is not dead. As were his family, his apostles, his disciples, and I insist, all those who wrote the New Testament. Okay? I feel very sad that Luke is always shoved into the category of Gentiles. Luke is also Jewish, in my opinion. We are aware, starting from Nostra Aetate, of the tragic history that we share with the Jewish people, and how too often we were the sources of tragedy. And again, when we say we are, another very interesting anecdote. The we is predominantly white Europeans. this was something that had to be discovered by the white Europeans at the council, that yes, the people in the Middle East were very concerned about the manipulation, the political manipulation of all this pro-Jewish talk. And so Pope Paul VI sent two delegations, one delegation in 1965 to Damascus and to Beirut, and a second delegation in that same year, a little later, to Jerusalem and to Cairo, to speak to the Catholic heads of churches and the Orthodox heads of churches, all the Christians of the Middle East. And when they came back, those delegations, and brought their report, Yves Congar, very important Dominican theologian of the Second Vatican Council, a great supporter of paragraph 4, suddenly had a wake-up experience when he realized that the Shoah, the Holocaust, which was such a motor to bring Catholics to an open attitude to Jews, was not really on the horizon of the Christians in the Middle East. After all, they had not shoved Jews into the gas chambers. And Jews were more for them, as they are still today for many Christians who live in this land, soldiers and settlers and policemen. Again, we are Catholic, and Catholic means opening to all of these perspectives, and for Congar it was those reports brought back. So a tragic history. The determination that has been expressed over and over again to fight anti-Judaism, any contempt for the Jewish religion, and anti-Semitism, any racial hatred for Jews. Catholics are committed to that. And finally, I put a term that has been brought into the world of Christianity through the dialogue, tikkun olam, fixing a broken world, repairing a wounded humanity, so dear to both Pope John and Pope Paul. What happened in the council is very interesting, and it's a dynamic that was set in process with this initial focus on the need for something about the Jewish people, somehow transforming a teaching of contempt into a teaching of respect. And the dynamic that was set in motion was from the Jews to the world. So, a bishop from Japan who says, wow, yes, we want a teaching of respect, but we don't have any Jews. But we speak with complete contempt for our neighbors who are not Christian. In Indonesia, in India, in Africa, Asia, this started opening horizons that were not open for the first time, but became a movement. So from Europe to a much more global Catholicism, and this process continues as we speak, as the church becomes less Eurocentric and more global. That doesn't mean to say Europe doesn't have a voice, and an important one, but it might not be the only one. And so now we can read Nostra Aetate paragraph 1 as the document starts to take form, and we recognize here the personalities of John and Paul, the two popes, and this opening to a much broader sense of dialogue. In our time, Nostra Aetate, in our time, when day by day mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger, the Church examines more closely her relationship to non-Christian religions. Again, some of us might feel, they are being defined not as what they are, but as non-Christians. We're in 1965. This is revolution, that we're even willing to consider them on our map. In her task of promoting unity and love among men, again, cringe, among humans, okay, we're not yet in a time of inclusive language. Indeed, among nations, she considers above all in this declaration what human beings have in common and what draws them to fellowship. And the paragraph continues in this spirit, a vision of harmony, of a possible harmony. At the end, the conclusion, very powerful and very evangelical. We cannot truly call on God, the parent of all, if we refuse to treat in a fraternal, sororal way any person created as he or she is in the image of God. The human being's relation to God, the parent, and the human being's relation to other human beings who are brothers and sisters are so linked together that Scripture says the one who does not love does not know God. Powerful statement from a tradition of judging. Because we don't have a lot of time, I want to move to paragraph 3. Again, it was an enormous shift, a 180-degree turnaround. Nostra Aetate, paragraph 3, dialogue with Muslims. You see there the picture from 1964, January. Pope Paul was for the Feast of the Epiphany here in the Holy Land, and there he is with King Hussein, a young King Hussein in 1964. The picture above, Pope Paul visiting Uganda in 1969, I think, and again, one of the very important meetings in Uganda with Muslims, and of course a page from the Quran. Let's listen to just the beginning of that paragraph 3. And notice I've put in dark letters the seismic change. The Church regards with esteem, profound respect. How different from Crusaders and Inquisition. The Church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men and women. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even God's inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. And of course, if we translate submitted to God, what would we say? Muslimin, all submitted to God. So the dialogue with Muslims, again, what is it taking as its essential core? First of all, a shared religious discourse, like with Jews. We speak in a language that is very, very shared about God. For we have as its very source a biblical tradition. God is creator. God speaks to the human person. We are faced with a tragic history. We need healing. And the history with Islam, if we think of just a few examples, whether it's the Crusades or the colonialism of the Muslim world, North Africa, Asia, and the submission of those Muslim countries to European rule, we need to reflect on that and find healing. We are committed, as we are with Jews, to fighting anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. We are committed to fighting Islamophobia. I say we are committed. It's a hope. And of course, like with the Jews, we want to build a shared world, a world where everyone is respected. I put there again a modern icon of a very renowned meeting, the meeting of St. Francis of Assisi, who came during the period of the Crusades, but not to fight against the Muslims, not to kill Muslims. And so he went to Damietta and met there with El-Malik el-Kamil, the Muslim leader in Egypt. And it seems from reports, again, how much of this is mythologized in the 20th and 21st century, I don't know, but it seems that they really understood one another. They recognized in each other people of great spiritual insight, and so provided a very different model for what relationship can be between Muslims and Christians. And the dialogue has moved on, and Pope Francis, in a very special way, has dedicated a lot of effort to cultivating dialogue with the Muslim world. One of his main partners in dialogue has been Sheikh al-Azhar, Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Egyptian preeminent authority. We poor Catholics, we're always looking for a Jewish pope and a Muslim pope to speak to. And that's our great sadness. We don't find that single authority. But we always look, and so we've turned Sheikh al-Tayyib into a kind of pope, which he isn't. And of course, we will all know about the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, published in 2019. I quote just one little piece from that document, again a shared language. Faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God, who has created the universe, creatures and all human beings, equal on account of God's mercy, believers are called to express this human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe and supporting all persons, especially the poorest and those most in need, a vision of life together. And so, Nostra Aetate, since the 1960s, is promoting various levels of dialogue. We know this. I'll run through it very quickly. A dialogue of life, a dialogue of religious experience, a dialogue of action, and a dialogue of theological reflection. Won't go into it because I see the time is running away. Challenges. It's not simple. Not simple. We have a beautiful, harmonious picture in those three singers coming together. But of course, there are lots of problems on the way. And very briefly, I'd like to mention some of the issues that Catholics are dealing with, first in the dialogue with the Jewish people. Documents that were published after Nostra Aetate, 4 very significant documents, and in these documents we deal with 4 very serious issues. 1974, in a document called Orientations and Suggestions for the Implementation of Nostra Aetate, we commit to something that is not simple at all in dialogue. We commit to learn by what essential traits the Jews define themselves in the light of their own religious experience. Nostra Aetate is still speaking about Jews out there, and we are saying what's good about them, what's bad about them, what we love about them, and what we don't. Here, in 1974, after those years of dialogue, we realize that an engagement with another must leave room for the other to define how the other sees herself. And that, of course, can provoke discomfort when we discover that our Jewish partners in dialogue sometimes aren't interested in talking about the Old Testament as preparation for Jesus, and are interested in talking about how the Jewish scriptures point to the Jewish ownership of this land. Problems start emerging, moments of crises, and we're in one right now. A second document talks exactly about the land as it becomes more and more evident that today many, many Jews, the vast majority of the Jewish people, see this land as a homeland in some sense. And so the document says Christians are invited to understand this Jewish religious attachment to this land, which finds its roots in biblical tradition, and then the statement says with clarity, without, however, making their own any particular religious interpretation of this relationship. And the document adds, the existence of the State of Israel and its political options should be envisaged not in a perspective which is in itself religious, but in their reference to the common principles of international law. That has also created, not only yesterday because of Gaza, but right from the beginning, a lot of tension in the dialogue. The third document that came out in 1998, we remember, that deals with anti-Semitism and the very prickly question of, did Christianity prepare in some way for what happened in the history of Europe leading up to the Holocaust? Did anti-Jewish sentiment among Christians make them less sensitive or even indifferent to the persecutions launched against the Jews by National Socialism when it reached power? Question mark. And by asking the question, we are putting our tradition under the light of a criticism. Is that the sign for me to shut up? Okay, I promise I will shut up very shortly. Okay, and the fourth document, which raises a very theologically prickly question, the document that was published 50 years after Nostra Aetate, the gifts and the calling of the are never revoked. I read from that document, another focus for Catholics must continue to be the highly complex theological question of how Christian belief in the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ can be combined in a coherent way with the equally clear statement of faith in the never revoked covenant of God with Israel. So on the one hand, we do believe as Christians, that's part of our faith, that Jesus has come for everyone, to bring salvation for everyone, Gentile and Jew. But on the other hand, we also now affirm with absolute clarity that God has an ongoing relationship with the Jewish people who do not believe in Jesus. How can we affirm both of these in a respectful dialogue with the Jewish people? It is the belief of the Church that Christ is Savior for all, and then clearly added, not to the pleasure of our Jewish dialogue partners, there cannot be two ways of salvation. Okay? Maybe we aren't as saved as we think. Maybe we're also just on the way. Challenges in the dialogue with Muslims, again, that question of salvation. Okay, what is the relationship between mission, preaching Jesus, and dialogue, making place for the other in our lives? A very, very complex question that comes to the fore after Vatican II. Our history, and please notice as I say it, our shared history of violence. What do we do about it? We are very good about seeing the violence in the other and the violence that the other commits against us. We are not so conscientious in thinking about the violence that comes from us towards the other. Okay, by the way, I love reading with my students a little piece of one of the great mystical theologians of the Middle Ages. We all love to love him, Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote some of the most stupendous commentary on the Song of Songs, really the peak of Christian mystical writing. Well, I invite you to go and read one of his writings about the Crusades, where he writes about Muslims in terms that make him sound a little bit like Osama bin Laden. Writing history. How do we write that history? big question. It's a question with Muslims, it's a question with Jews. How can we come to a shared narrative of what happened in the past? And that leads us to, of course, a central issue to do with education. How do we educate our children to live together, to respect one another, and more than that, to celebrate difference rather than sameness? Final slide, I promise. The image from Pope Francis's visit to the Holy Land in 2014. He did something rather unexpected. As the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic Church as a whole, not only Roman, he came accompanied by two friends from Argentina, a sheikh and an imam. Rabbi Skorka, I said a sheikh and an imam. No one corrected me. I gather you're all sleeping. Okay. Rabbi Abraham Skorka and Sheikh Mahir Aboud. Okay. He came with them both. Towards the future, what are we looking at? We're looking at a church becoming more and more global, less and less focused uniquely on the experience of Europe. By the way, Francis is the first pope that we've had in centuries that is not a European, although he's very much a European in terms of being a proud Italian. But some of the shifts that we've seen, his turning towards Islam, some of his ability to focus criticism on Israeli politics is certainly a sign that he's not coming from a Europe ridden with guilt about the Jewish people. A challenge for this more global church, a church that no longer will refer in a very, very gut way to the Shoah as a founding moment. That was Vatican II, but it's not going to be true for a Catholic from Indonesia or from Kenya or from Brazil. What is the uniqueness of the dialogue with the Jews? There is a uniqueness, absolutely. What is it? What is it that we share when we hold a huge part of our scriptures in common? When we reflect upon Jesus as a member of the Jewish people? When we appreciate that the New Testament is Jewish literature? Far away from sociology and politics, there is a uniqueness to be discovered. What is there for a global church when we meet with Muslims who repeat, La ilaha illallah, only God is God? What does that introduce into our theological discourse in terms of encountering the other in humility, perhaps a little less sure that we are saved and everyone else is damned? What can we do to focus on education, history, and values, and particularly the questions of justice, equality, and peace? So important for this land. And finally, how can we come to a coherent discourse about the Jesus that we follow, that we preach, that we believe is the light salvation for all, making space for the reality of the other in our lives, that other, that you who is a Jew, that you who is a Muslim, has something very important to teach us, because we don't yet know it all. Thank you.